Are you noticing a greater abuse of words?
Yeah, not only in abusive words, people are completely changing. That this is, you can take this for what it's worth. This is my opinion about how this is metastasized throughout our institutions. It's not that they're making up words, they have neologisms or what have you. It's that they're completely changing the meanings of words. And they're taking words with a positive valence, changing the meanings of those words, and then instituting policies on the basis of the new meanings of words.
What
Like,
kinds of examples? What kinds of things? Yeah.
to give you tons of examples, equity is probably the most prominent example. Most people don't know what equity means, and in fact, well, let me rephrase that. Most people have heard of the word equity in terms of, the amount of money you have in a house if you owe the bank, right? So they've taken a term. It has a positive valence, and my kid's school now, everything is equity. My former employer, Portland State University, every email, equity, equity, equity. But when you ask people, I was at a faculty department meeting and somebody actually didn't know what equity meant. They looked it up and they said fairness. And they said, well, okay, it just means fairness. And I said, okay, well, you want to use the word fairness, let's do that. Equity is the opposite of fairness, and it's the absolute antithesis. It's the antithesis of equality.
Why do you say it's the opposite of fairness? It's often constructed as indistinct, to make it distinct from equality, where critics of equality say, well, it's all very well to let everyone start out at the same place, but because of historical injustices and intergenerational trauma and so on, it's actually important to give people who are falling behind an extra benefit, which is not equality. That would be equity, because that's actually the fairest way to make sure that outcomes are more similar. Why is that not fair?
Because you just two things. Did you see how you smuggled in outcomes there?
Yeah, I didn't smuggle it in. I intentionally put it in there because that's what they
okay,
talk
but
about.
At no point in the conversation had outcomes previously come in. So equity.
Well, I mean, it's relevant to people who think that fairness should be judged by outcomes, not just in inputs.
Okay, I guess in that case, I would have to ask how they derive their conception of fairness. Is that a rationally derivable conception of fairness? Like, on what principle? So, if we talk about John Rawls, we could talk about how is that notion of fairness? How do we get that notion of fairness?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not the one who's putting forward this idea of fairness, but I think it comes to a lot of people instinctively that if you have a system that is sort of a rigged game where you end up with outcomes that are different for reasons that are trivial, such as, say, the color of one's skin or one's sex, then it's fairer to try to modify those outcomes.
Okay, so when you say
I don't know that they're consciously doing a Rawlsian theory of justice.
Well, I'm just saying. In other words, I'm trying to differentiate it from. I'm trying to figure out where they get this notion. But okay, but let's just accept that by fiat. But even in that case, that means by definition that some people have to be treated unfairly. By definition.
Yes.
Okay,
yes, so you mean the people who have the privilege need to be treated unfairly to create space for the unprivileged to end up in the same spot. Yeah.
So then equity is by definition not fair.
I see. Yes, well, there's a differential treatment, but it depends on how you define fair, as you say, whether or not you're looking at outcomes or only inputs.
Correct. Traditional definitions of fair have I mean, so again, these are conversations we're having. I'm happy to actually have this conversation. But one thing that I found, to kind of bring it up a level, I'll go down with you more if you want, is that people are using equity as a synonym for equality, and they're using it as a broad paintbrush for fairness. And I'm saying that it's the antithesis of equality. And it's not fair because some people have to be treated differently. Now, if you want to claim that it's fair, for example, to discriminate against Asians on the basis of their admissions to universities, particularly in math and sciences, I'd like to hear that argument. I'd like to hear that, because it's equitable, but it's not fair.
Since we're digging into the kind of what's underpinning the sort of moral philosophy of these conceptions, something that's just occurring to me, which is, there are clearly differences in people's conceptions about fairness as to whether or not you're looking at group outcomes or individual outcomes. And it strikes me that there's been a shift in recent years from looking at fairness towards individuals to emphasizing fairness among groups. And I wonder whether or not
Correct.
you can enlighten me on that.
Well, not everyone who participates in an identity group, for example, has the same socioeconomic status. Jaden Smith, Will Smith's son would be an example, or O.J. Simpson, or what have you. Now, that doesn't mean that the mode statistically of people don't fall into certain categories, but you can't assume that because someone is white, a poor person in the Appalachians, that they have any kind of substantive advantage. In fact, quite the contrary. So in a sense that this orthodoxy has bartered socioeconomic status for identity markers.